So first of all, I'd like to say welcome to everybody to our data loss prevention webinar today in conjunction with Microsoft. My name is Paul Connery. I'm Principal Consultant with CWSI, and with me today I have Stephen Parker, one of our Security Solutions Architects, and we're going to be talking to you in the area of DLP in Microsoft. Just a small bit of housekeeping before we start. We encourage people to interact as much as possible with the session, and we may have enough numbers on today that we're going to keep the microphones muted. But if you could please put any questions or comments into the chat window and we'll address them as we go along. There will be some time at the end for Q&A, but it can sometimes work better if we can address the questions directly, contextualizing them with what we're talking about at that time. So please feel free to jump in at any point. Okay. Stephen, if you'd just like to go to the next slide, thanks very much. So the agenda for today is we're going to do a little introduction around who CWSI are. Some of you might know of us and some of you might not. Then we're going to talk about some of the challenges around preventing data leaks, or some of the challenges that data leaks cause organizations. We're going to talk about the stages of a data loss prevention or DLP strategy. We're going to talk about some of the controls around governance and compliance. We're going to do a small bit around Microsoft threat protection and how it fits into a data loss prevention strategy. And we have an example of a customer case example or a case study to try and talk through around how we worked with a customer to solve some of these problems. So a little around CWSI. So as a company, we were founded in 2011 in Ireland, and we specialized in what then was just mainly mobile working, but became modern working. And basically the purpose of the company is to enable and secure hybrid working. So we work with organizations and have done since the advent of iOS and Android, and now in the last number of years, much more so with Windows and Mac as well, to enable people to work securely from anywhere. And our goal really is to enable people to work with any application on any device from any network without compromising on the user experience or compromising on security. We have a primarily European reach, although we do have global customers and we do service customers globally. But our initial base was in Ireland, and then we acquired an organization in the UK in 2021, and recently in 2022 we've now expanded into the Benelux region and the Netherlands through acquisition of a number of organizations that did very similar things to ourselves. So we're now over 120 staff across 5 countries, servicing all of Western Europe and multinational customers around the world. So why are we here to talk about, why are we talking about data loss prevention? So data access is evolving outside traditional borders of business. So as you can probably tell by the gray hairs of being in IT for quite a long time, when I started out, all you had to worry about was what was inside the 4 walls of your organization. You had an enclosed network, and you had all your devices and data were held within that data center, within the devices within that network. There might have been a little bit of remote access, but it wasn't a huge amount of what we did. That's completely inverted in terms of how people tend to work today. People now are using all sorts of proliferation of devices. They're using tablets, they're using phones, they're using laptops, they're using non-Windows devices. They're accessing data while on the move, in planes, trains, airports, wherever they are. A huge amount of people are working from home. As you can see, both myself and Stephen are doing that today. Hybrid working has become the norm. This was the norm for us even before COVID, but I think post-COVID has now become, the majority way of working is a hybrid way of working. So people are working from their houses, they're working from offices, but they're also working from various other places, potentially cafes, restaurants, wherever they are. So we've got multiple locations you could be working from. People are accessing via multiple platforms, as I mentioned. It's not just the kind of Windows, Intel-centric world. It's all sorts of different platforms, Android, iOS, Chrome OS, Mac OS are all different platforms that people could potentially be using. They're accessing multiple clouds, so they're obviously Microsoft, but they're also accessing other potential SaaS applications or infrastructure on AWS or GCP. So there's a huge amount of different cloud and SaaS applications people could be accessing, and then all different kinds of applications. There's things like the Office suite, but there's a huge proliferation of line of business apps. And in a lot of cases, there is a growing increase of what could be considered consumer grade applications and technology, like smartphones, for example, being used to access corporate resources. So it's become a very complex environment. And it's accelerating. So every year, the amount of data that moves outside the corporate borders increases. And there's a expectation that we'll be at 175 zettabytes by 2025. I'm not entirely sure how big a zettabyte is. I remember when a gigabyte was a big thing, and that comes as standard now of terabytes nearly coming as standard on laptops. So a zettabyte is a huge amount of data. And what's driving this is obviously all the things we spoke about already: cloud services, SaaS apps, remote working, different types of devices. IoT starting to come in now, so huge amounts of data coming in from IoT into cloud services. Massive proliferation of IoT devices into various verticals, for example, farming, tech, manufacturing, retail, IoT, and smart devices are proliferating through all of those industries. A massive increase in the use of multiple partners in how organizations work and very complex supply chains. And then things like social media and all those different areas are all driving a huge proliferation of data. So there's an explosion of the amount of data that we all have to manage in our organizations, which comes with massive opportunity in terms of all that data is a huge resource to mine and use to drive value within our businesses and improve our outcomes for customers and our products. However, it also comes with risk, and all that extra data needs to be managed, it needs to be classified and understood so we can put adequate controls around it. So there's a number of challenges to safeguarding all that data. So doing some research with various organizations, it's been shown that one of the #1 items that people are worried about is protecting and governing sensitive data, particularly around regulated data. For those of us in Europe, or for anyone who has European customers, or European staff, things like GDPR is a massive concern, or a regulation that we need to comply with. And that has strict requirements around how we manage and control set personal data, and particularly sensitive personal data. So all organizations process personal data to some degree. Just their basic employee data will mean they'll be processing personal and sensitive personal, but obviously in most cases you're processing large amounts of customer data as well. And it's critical that we have controls in place to know where that data is for its entire life cycle, know where the sensitive data is, protect it while it's stored and protect it in transit, and ensure that we can access it, present it when required, or remove it when it's no longer needed. And that can be quite challenging in the kind of unstructured, complex, very volatile, fast-changing world that we find ourselves with data. Over 63% of organizations have a fear of a data leak or spillage during the pandemic, and that has only increased actually since the pandemic. We've seen numerous reports in the last couple of months where organizations are very concerned around data breaches, and I think the recent reports in Ireland, over 60% of organizations would have experienced some kind of data breach. And 88% of organizations no longer have confidence to detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. So one of the first questions I would ask any organization that I'd be talking to is, how comfortable are you that your sensitive data is managed and controlled? And in most cases, people aren't comfortable to give an answer because they don't have enough understanding of the status of where they are. So further challenges around information protection and governance, the rapid shift in how people work. Again, as we said, people have moved away from working in offices to working remotely, working hybrid, working flexible hours. And this changes lots of things, like something as simple as a clean desk policy. Let's say you're an organization that handles PCI credit card data. Most organizations would have had a very strict clean desk policy if that was the case, so people couldn't have pen and paper potentially even, so they couldn't write down PAN numbers or credit card information. If suddenly all those staff in your call center are working from home, how are you able to put similar controls in place to ensure that that data is protected? People working on doing conference calls or meetings remotely, are they taking into account who can hear them, who can see their screen? have they got similar controls in place in terms of where they're working from that they would have in the office? So have you trained your staff, and have you considered technical controls that can monitor and protect your data regardless of the kind of scenario of where they're working from? But it's also very important that when you do put any of those security controls in place, that you try to limit or eliminate any impact on productivity. Because at the end of the day, security controls are typically like insurance. They're there to help protect you in case of an issue. But if you put too many controls in place that actually impact the business, you're taking a potential risk and turning it into a real impact. So it's important that you have that balance between security and productivity, and you do good kind of comprehensive risk assessments, and you really balance the mitigations and controls you put in place with the actual risk. We're also seeing increased cost of breaches and regulations. So we've all seen, increasing number of fines from the likes of the data protection regulators, the DPC in Ireland or their equivalent across Europe. All the media organizations have been fined fairly heavily over the last number of years. And we would expect this to only continue as all of those offices and regulators are increasing in their capacity, and they're all increasing in size and funding. And so, while it may be focused on the large data processors at the moment, that will start to trickle down. And then there's increasing data privacy outside of just the GDPR. For example, we have the CCPA in California, which is very similar. We have acts in Australia, in places like Singapore. So there's increasing focus in globally on data privacy and ensuring that personal data of employees and customers is managed and governed in a appropriate manner. There's also a struggle, what we call dark data. So for example, many of us might have structured databases that have very good, strong controls on them. They're managed, their data is tagged, and we have a good kind of data model and understanding of what data is in those databases. But a huge amount of data is in what we would call dark or unstructured data. It's living inside in emails, in Teams chats, it's in SharePoint, it's in OneDrive, it's proliferating across maybe Azure infrastructure. There's numerous different places that data could be, and all of that could contain elements of personal, sensitive data, not just from a privacy point of view, but from the point of view of corporate IP or other important data to your organization. And cataloging and classifying and discovering that data so you can put controls on it can be challenging. When you've got multiple different environments, potentially data on-prem and in the cloud, and maybe across different SaaS solutions as well. And we're seeing a complex patchwork of bolt-on solutions. So in many cases, people might have a solution that they had on-prem, but they're migrating to the cloud, and they're seeing some maybe disparities between what their capabilities on-prem are and what they're doing in the cloud. And people are maybe trying to do point solutions in different or managing in different silos. So they might have a solution for one cloud vendor or one database or one location, but they might have something manual or only policy driven in other areas, and it can be kind of patchy, and it's not a comprehensive kind of approach. And also the challenge of kind of correlating signals to assess risk. So, there's a huge amount of potential signals that you can pick up from data. There's lots of good tools out there that can detect what people are doing with their data, how they're using their data. But, cutting through the noise of all those signals to get to what is actually useful to help you find risk in your organization requires, a thoughtful approach and, a good design to enable you to hone in on what you need to know. So for example, understanding your baselines, knowing what normal looks like. So if Paul or Stephen normally never download data from the sales SharePoint, and they normally never log in after 9 o'clock at night, if they suddenly do log in at 10 o'clock at night and download, gigabytes or more of data, that's probably something that you want to know and understand and see what's going on there. So being able to cut through the noise and identify those important signals so you can correlate those and really identify risk is important, but it can be challenging with the amount of noise that gets generated in organizations. Okay, so we're going to move on to some of the stages of a DLP strategy. So again, just for anyone who's joined since we started, if you have any questions as we go, please put them into the chat. We would like to address them as we move through the deck, rather than leaving everything till the end. So, if you have any questions or comments, please do. This webinar, we would like it to be as valuable and informative to all of you as possible. So please do send them in. Okay, so stages of a DLP strategy. So essentially, there's 4 key stages to an information protection and governance, or DLP, strategy. And they essentially are knowing your data, protecting your data, preventing data loss, and governing your data. So starting with know your data, right? So it's impossible to manage what you can't measure, as the old kind of saying goes. So if you don't understand your data landscape, if you don't know where your critical crown jewels, important data is, well, then it's going to be very difficult for you to assess the risk and put in adequate controls. So it's the first stage of any kind of engagement or any kind of project that anybody should be looking at is, how can they understand their data landscape? How can they categorize or classify their data? Where is it located? How is it moving through the organization? And then you can start to analyze what kind of risks you're carrying. And this obviously has to be done both in your cloud repositories, but also in your on-prem and your endpoints, where people are accessing the data from, because the data needs to be protected in all the locations it could be and all the locations it could move to and from. The second piece is around, once you kind of have that understanding of what your data landscape looks like, is how do I protect my data? What can I do to protect that data? So, things that you could use is data classification. So we're talking about in the Microsoft world, you have the capability using what are called sensitivity labels, which are, a form of data tagging, a label that you can use, and you can apply to documents, to locations, containers such as email or SharePoint sites or Office 365 groups, and allows you to apply a label to a data to classify it. So, for example, if you wanted to classify confidential data or top secret or sensitive personal data, you could then apply these labels to those objects, to those documents, and the label moves with the data. So, if I send an email to Stephen and it has an attachment, and that attachment has been labeled as highly confidential, that label stays with it. And then if, in the next stage, if we put some DLP controls or stuff around it, they will move with the data. So for example, we decide that data should be encrypted, or it can't leave the boundaries of our tenant, or it can't be downloaded to a untrusted device. All of those kind of controls will move with the classification. So it's not tied to a specific silo. So even if Stephen was to download that file to his local laptop, he wouldn't be able to remove that label. It would always stay with it. And this then allows us to apply various different protection models. So encryption is obviously one that would have been used a lot. It can be tricky, and I think there's some more advanced DLP controls where maybe encryption is a hammer to crack a nut. But there's still a lot of use cases out there for encryption. For example, defense in depth. So if you assume breach and assume that your data is going to leak, at least if you have an encryption layer on it, then it's 256 AES encrypted. There's very little chance that anybody is going to be able to crack that. So even if the file does get outside your environment, you're still protected. And also then you can do controls around sharing with other organizations to grant them access to that encrypted data. You can also set up access restrictions. So as I said, you can create boundaries. So you can prevent data moving externally, but also potentially internally. Like you could have use cases where you don't want certain types of data to be seen outside of, for example, if you look at the CIA triad, security triad, the confidentiality element, if you don't want everyone in your organization to see payroll data, you don't want everyone in your organization to see sensitive IP, for example. You could have, the requirement to have Chinese walls in your organization because of regulatory or bid requirements. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to create access restrictions within your environment. And then also you get the ability to do nice things like visual marking. So watermarks, headers, footers. Again, these can be really useful to meet regulatory requirements, that documents need to be visually classified. But also, for example, we spend a lot of time now on video calls, sharing data. If you have a watermark clearly on the screen, that helps, if someone was to take a screenshot, that it's still attributable back to your organization, back to that presenter. So you still have some element of kind of protection and governance around that file from a confidentiality point of view. Yeah, so then we move on to prevention. So, how do we prevent unauthorized or accidental sharing or transfer of data with policies? So again, controls around, the point of modern collaboration suites like Office 365, like other tooling, things like Teams and SharePoint is to make it easy to collaborate. That's the purpose. That's what raises productivity and gives value to organizations. However, that ease to collaborate does introduce potential for risk. So, it's important that you put some controls in place to specify what is appropriate levels of sharing in your organization. So is there data that should never be shared outside the organization? Is there data that should never be you shouldn't be able to create an anonymous sharing link from SharePoint. You need to do a nominated named link, or you need to ensure that that link cannot then be shared to anybody else, or you want to put timeouts on that link or the availability of that data so that it times out after a certain period. You want to put blocks around guest access within tenants, and in terms of whether guests can access certain Teams channels that might have sensitive data in them, or you want to prevent the ability to paste sensitive data into things like chats. There's some recent very updates to some of the purview controls. We might talk a little bit later on, but one of the interesting ones is around things like OCR recognition. So even if someone was to take a screenshot of a credit card number from an internal document or system, that could still be read and prevented in terms of being shared externally or being posted into an email or a Teams channel. So there's lots of good controls there that you can use to prevent data loss from your organization. And you can even just do monitoring. So at least you know what's happening in terms of people sharing the data, and you can grant controls to people that they can share certain types of data, but they have to give business justification, so you have an audit trail. And then finally, we have the data lifecycle element, the kind of governing your data. So, going back to things like data privacy regulation, or, if you're an organization that has, for example, contracts with customers that you need to, maintain a document for the lifetime of that contract, and then maybe for 1 year after, but then you need to delete it. There's lots of good, reasons why you need to put data lifecycle controls in place. Typically, things like retention or deletion policies, or some kind of archiving policy. So it's important to be able to manage your data lifecycle, because once that data proliferates, going back to all the stuff we spoke about at the start, it's a huge amount of data to manage, and so it's very difficult to have manual controls or processes there for people to do that. You've got hundreds or thousands of documents that need to be managed. So there is lots of capabilities out there that you can look at within, for example, the Microsoft suite around creating retention policies. So again, similar to sensitivity labels, you can use things called retention labels or retention policies, and you can specify how long a document should be retained for, and then what happens at the end of that time period. So do you want it to be automatically deleted? Do you want someone to be notified to make a decision to do some kind of disposition review? Or do you want to move it to a separate policy, a different repository or a different location to archive it? All of those kind of capabilities are common use cases in organizations that need to be automated, and have a full kind of governance and audit trail. It's also important that these interact with things like, legal hold and e-discovery and those kind of elements as well, so that if you are doing an e-discovery or a subject access request, like a DSAR or some other kind of data discovery, or an FOI, depending on what kind of organization you are, that you can ensure that data does not get deleted or removed, because it meets those legal requirements to discover that data and provide it as required. So these are all important elements of your full data lifecycle management and governance. So again, to kind of recap, in the know your data element, is important that you monitor your data, so you need to discover it. the slide has jumped to me there. So you need to understand your data landscape, identify your important data across your hybrid environment. This is kind of a summary of what we already spoken about. You need to protect that data by classifying it and applying protection based on that classification. And protection can take the form of encryption, access restrictions, visual markings, or from prevention point of view, sharing controls, access controls, and managing upload or download of that data to cloud or endpoints. All of those kind of data movement controls can be put in place. And then finally, the full data lifecycle element, being able to manage the lifecycle of your data as it moves through your organization, and ensuring that it's only held for as long as it needs to be and is either removed or archived as appropriate. And all of this can be done in the Microsoft ecosystem through the unified approach and the Purview suite and a set of graph APIs and labeling, unified labeling that's available to enable you to do all this work both in your tenant, and also it can extend to on-prem. And there's also the capability to extend things like sensitivity labeling into non-Microsoft locations, such as SaaS applications like ServiceNow or Salesforce or other type solutions. Okay, before we move to the next section, is there any questions on anything we've covered so far? Hopefully all of this, again, some of you might be very aware of all these capabilities, or might be very advanced in terms of your data protection, classification, or retention programs. So if there is any questions or anything you want to ask, please feel free to throw them into the chat. Okay, Stephen, if you want to go ahead there.
Yeah. Okay, so Paul's covered the aspects of a DLP strategy, but what I wanted to talk about really was around some of the controls that you should be looking to implement. So to start off with, there are really some of the basic controls that we'd recommend, standard that are applied to your devices. So on the screen here, you can see some of the standard basic iOS restrictions. So we'd recommend first of all blocking the viewing of corporate data in unmanaged applications. So this would prevent users from being able to open a corporate document within an unmanaged Dropbox application or a Notes application, for instance. You've then got control around allowing unmanaged applications to read contact details. So there's a balance here between usability and control. So if you're using, say, Outlook as your application, then you want to be able to have that caller ID come up. But so this is one that's a little bit of a grey area as to what you would look to configure. You can do things around, blocking AirDrop. So you force AirDrop to be treated as an unmanaged application. So the data then, is stopped from being able to be, sent out via AirDrop. You've then got, around, the other way. So stopping managed applications from viewing unmanaged data. So this is a good, mechanism to try and stop infiltration of data into your organization. And then, another good control is around the copy and paste. So, being able to stop people from just copying data out of an Outlook application or a Word document on a device and just pasting it into a text message or a WhatsApp application that you don't really have any control over. And then on an iOS device, particularly with the corporate-owned personally enabled mode, you've got those controls around blocking data from leaving the work profile on a device and being accessible into the personal profile. And you've also got that ability to, tweak and refine that sharing of the work and personal, the data between those work and personal profiles. So hopefully everybody's, doing that, those basic controls as a starting point. So that's really the first layer that we would recommend in terms of, providing a DLP strategy. Then the next layer that I'd like to look at is around app protection. So you've looked at putting controls on the devices and the managed applications, the unmanaged applications. With the Microsoft suite, you can do that further site control and apply app protection policies to the So this gives you these, really 4 elements around the multi-identity awareness. So for things like the mail application on an iOS device, you can just protect the corporate side of it, and don't really influence the personal side. In terms of data protection, you can specify that the data is encrypted. There are controls around the way that mechanisms can go between managed and unmanaged applications. And then you can do things around like the selective wipe of corporate data. So, it's like if you're in a scenario where you're just doing it's like a BYO, then you don't have any control over the device, but you can still retain control over the application that's installed on that device. And similarly, you can look at access requirements. So rather than going the full site scenario of protecting the device with a PIN code or a passcode, you can just protect the application. So anytime that the application is launched on a device, the user either has to enter a PIN code, or they can access it via using Face ID or Touch ID, for instance. And then with the app protection policies, you've also got controls around conditional launching of the app. So the application can check to see whether it meets a certain set of requirements that are configured within your Intune environment. So for instance, you can look at whether the device has been jailbroken, or whether there's a a threat defense application on there, like Defender for Endpoint. And you can even go down to looking at the operating system version, or whether the device is an actual model or a manufacturer you support. So you can specify controls around saying from an Android device that you're not going to allow anything from Huawei to be able to open your corporate data. And then following on from, so we've got device controls, then we've got application controls, and then within the Microsoft suite, you've got those compliance policies that can be applied. And so this doesn't necessarily look at, this is around, applying your corporate compliance restrictions to devices that are accessing your data. So you can look at, the device settings. So again, has the device got a PIN code on it? Has it been jailbroken? Is there encryption on it? You can look at the operating system. So the settings that are in the operating system, what security patches are on there. You can look at the integrity of the applications that are on the device. So is the app that's coming in and requesting access, is that an approved application? Is it one that's been installed from an unknown source, etc.? And then you can add in the threat level of the device. So with if you're deploying Microsoft Defender to the device, and then that's interrogating the device and the applications that are on there. If that reports back that there's a risk on the device, then you can apply different compliance policies based upon that risk level that's reported back. So how does that work in in practice? So in this scenario, we've got a user who's coming in from a device. So endpoint manager is checking the compliance policy and the compliance aspects of that device. So that device reports back into endpoint manager, into Intune, to say that these are my compliance, the responses to the compliance policy. And then Intune will report back into conditional access to say that that device meets all of those compliance policy settings. And so when the user tries to access any resources, the request is granted and the data is able to be viewed on the device. That same user, if they then come in from a device that doesn't meet your compliance policies with conditional access, the device responds back in to just say, for instance, that the device isn't compliant because it doesn't have a required application on there. The compliance policy platform responds back into Azure Active Directory to say that that device isn't compliant. And so when the user tries to access the organization data, the request is, is denied. So even though the user can come in from one device that meets all of those requirements, doesn't mean that they are automatically going to get access on another device. Okay, so those are the basics that we would expect organizations to deploy and to use within a DLP strategy.
We have one question just come in there. Just all the controls you spoke about there, you showed some of the iOS and Android ones. Do they also extend to Windows and Mac OS?
There are controls that are can be applied to Windows and to Mac devices. So things like Defender for Endpoint could go into a Mac device. With Windows, you have the information protection. So there are slightly different controls that you can apply to them. But yes, you can link all of those different platforms into an overall strategy that looks at the compliance and the conditional access.
Okay, and then we've one other question. I think it was more addressed to me, which was a question around where do you start with data classification if previously that was manual and not comprehensive across all data types. So yeah, this is very common. Most people, in my previous lifetime, I probably got involved with several data classification projects that just couldn't get off the ground because we didn't know where to start and it was very complex. So going back to what I said earlier, the first thing to do is really to kind of understand your data. Now that in itself may be scary, but there are tools out there that you can run that can automatically discover and classify some of your data for you, or at least give some initial suggested classifications. Within the Microsoft tooling itself, there are some pre-canned, sense info types for things like PCI, GDPR, all those kind of elements. And then there's also other kind of tooling. For example, we would have a tool that we use that can go in and uses kind of machine learning capabilities to identify and begin classifying things like financial, HR, personal data, so that you can begin to get an idea. Sometimes though, the easiest thing to do is to start with a specific business unit. So for example, finance or HR or sales, and just start working on their data and discover, what is the critical data for them and where is that critical data. It's the kind of eat the elephant approach, break it into small chunks, prove the model with one department in terms of its tooling, and then move on to, iterate that around the rest of your business if it proves successful.
Cool, thanks, Paul. Next section, what I just wanted to cover around threat protection, and I mean there are so many different services available from Microsoft in this area, and I just wanted to cover a couple of them and give some examples really about how they can be used within a DLP strategy that you implement within your organization. So the two that I really wanted to look at is around endpoint DLP and cloud app security. And rather than so go through all of the different features and the functionality, but I thought it'd be slightly easier to bring it home a little bit and just give it's like a couple some examples of how the platform can work and the experience that end users will actually see when they are, working in an environment where these services are deployed. So so what we're going to look at is around things like, as Paul said earlier, that you can classify the data and, so recognize whether things are things like credit card information or intellectual property. So, with a couple of the examples look at around, data that has credit card information in them. And then, so we'll see how that can be protected with the DLP controls. So in this example, users got a Word document that's got some credit card details in, and what they're trying to do is to just copy some of that data, and you can see that automatically, the DLP is out and saying that copying, information out of a document that has credit card details in it is against the policy, and so it's blocked. And it's quite an intuitive and fairly straight, simple way that the platform, tells the end user why they can't do it. It's not really just blocking it and they don't know what's happening. There's a, a very clear message that it's around data loss prevention and it's against the organization's policy. So in the next clip, what we've got is, we're not looking at, a credit card details or personal information. So this is around, intellectual property. And so, you can configure endpoint DLP to recognize intellectual property based upon things like the title of a project. So if a document has, in this case, Project Obsidian in there, then any of the data within it is classed as intellectual property. And so you can put controls around that to prevent that data being copied out of it. And so, it's not just around copying. So in this case here, we've got a user who's trying to print a document that's got credit card information in it. So you can control that with, within endpoint DLP, it will stop that, user from being able to print that data. And then we have, a control where, a user's put in a USB device into their laptop, and you can protect the copying of sensitive data onto an external USB drive. And then this is one around a user's trying to send data to a web resource. So in this case, we've got Dropbox, which is an approved website within the DLP scenario. So Edge in this case is able to understand DLP policies, and so Edge determines that this action's against the policy and so prevents it from being completed. So these are examples on on a Windows machine, but we can also do similar controls around Mac devices, for instance. So again, what the user's trying to do here is print a document that's got sensitive information, and it's being blocked. But then we also have the ability for some for some DLP controls to be able to do a manual override. So you'll start to see when it comes up that the user tries to print, says it's against the policy, but then gives the option to have a, so the manager's said that I'm approved to be able to print this, this document. And then the final one that I just wanted to go over is around cloud app security. So the previous ones around that endpoint DLP protection. With cloud app security, you can extend the controls that you can configure to third-party resources. So for instance, in this example, we have Salesforce, and what we've got configured is a download based on the site content inspection. So this is going to happen in real time on the device. So the user will, so go into Salesforce. They'll be told that Salesforce is actually being monitored. So the user knows that their actions are being monitored, and that, so reports will be generated on this. So the user goes into Salesforce, and then under the the due diligence documents, they can they're going to try to so they'll right click on the document. They can view the information. They'll then try to click on the download link, but that download's blocked because the Cloud App Security has determined that action is not allowed. So you've got that ability to extend, those DLP controls into, into the third-party products and services. So I just wanted to finish my section just around tying it all together. So you've got the Defender suite that gives you the controls around being able to block data from being copied from applications, and using cloud apps to block users from doing third-party systems. You've got configurations and app management that you can push down via Intune, so you can send controls down to devices to stop them from doing certain actions. And then you have the compliance policies and the conditional access that can then restrict the types of devices and the types of applications that can access data. So with all of these, it gives you that ability to really lock down your corporate data and protect it at all different areas. So, so I just wanted to really say that it's not just one product. You've got to look at a suite of products to be able to give you that overarching DLP strategy.
Okay, so thanks very much, Stephen. That was really, really useful to show, the actual what it looks like from an endpoint point of view. And on everything that Stephen spoke about there in terms of all those controls builds on the sensitivity label type capabilities. So you label the data, and then you can use those DLP controls to manage what happens to that data. There's also options. You don't have to use sensitivity labels. There's capability within the DLP controls to, to classify and discover data based on silos, locations, various different types. But generally the kind of full holistic strategy is to get to use your sensitivity labels to identify the data, and then appropriate controls can be applied across across your different risk models or what you're worried about. And we did have another question come in there while you were talking there, Stephen, around PCI. So I think I might have mentioned this already. So the question was, is there anything built into Microsoft for PCI DSS? So yeah, there is a whole bunch of templates that come in the Purview suite around compliance and within the DLP. So, there is this concept of sensitive info types that you can use, which are a bunch of, pre-set up algorithms or, regular expressions or various different types of tooling to enable you to discover data. And one of those is credit card data, is PCI for specifically PAN numbers. So it can search within documents, OCR, text, all across your tenant and extend to on-prem, and also into potentially other locations to find that PCI, find those PAN numbers, and then you can apply one or more of the controls that Stephen was just showing you around that data. So to stop people copying and pasting in the first place, which I think was one of Stephen's first examples, or to paste it or use it in different locations, even in chats, for example. You could prevent someone pasting a PCI or a PAN number into a chat, and you can control what gets presented back in terms of the message to the end user. So they're violating a DLP policy. but there is capabilities in there to link to an FAQ and stuff like that, for example, to explain to them why they're violating the policy. And there's also capabilities, as Stephen demonstrated, to allow for an override, because there may be a valid business use case there to do, do it in that specific case. I think we've one other question has come in there as well, which is there anything practical to prevent employees exfiltrating data via mobile phone, pictures of data displayed on a monitor while working from home? Well, that's going to be very difficult. Realistically, from a technical control point of view, probably not. It could be a mobile phone, it could just be a webcam that someone sets up to monitor everything you're doing. Really, that's going to come down to your training and your policy, and obviously things like how well you manage and monitor your users. However, there are a couple of things you could do. For example, by watermarking your data, you would at least know then if those images were shared on the internet or leaked in any way, you would be able to track down where they were leaked from, potentially. So, there is the possibility, for example, now to watermark a document shared in a Teams meeting with the email address of the person who's sharing the data. That's a new feature that's just come out very recently. So straight away, if we had that turned on here, you would see Stephen's name or email address, done as a watermark on this document. So if you were to take a video of it, we would know where it came from. So that's one potential control you could put in place. And then there is an insider risk module within the Purview suite in Microsoft, which could potentially identify people who would do something risky. So we'll look at how people share data, access data, going back to that baseline and understanding what normal looks like, and then looking for aberrations, tracking things like you could integrate it with your HR system. So people who might be about to leave the organization or who could have disciplinary stuff going on, you could put them as a higher risk and put a higher level of monitoring on them. So it might increase your chances of catching them. But there is no technical control that will really stop something like that. It's going to be a combination of other controls to try and limit the risk, and really comes down to good training and management. Okay, we have very little time left, so I'm going to very quickly run through this use case just to give a very quick example of what the kind of work that we've done with some customers around this area. So in this case, it's a university that we've been working with. They're in the process of migrating from on-premise file and collaboration platforms, file servers, SQL, SharePoint, to the cloud, like a lot of people out there are. They had some good security controls in place around their endpoint management and conditional access and all that good stuff that Stephen was talking about. And they were licensed via their A5, which is the equivalent of an E5 license, to have access to the full suite of Purview controls. And they wanted to really look at their data lifecycle management and get some good controls around their retention of data, and also some DLP capabilities as well. So again, going back to the ideal approach that I spoke about earlier, we started by doing discovery workshops to really understand their requirements and where their data is. We use some tooling to help them, very, very quickly. Within a week or two of plugging in the tool, we were able to show them where their financial and HR and personal data was located within their tenant. And that enabled us to help build a design for what the retention controls would be appropriate for their use cases and for the data where it was. We also made some recommendations in that activity around potential DLP controls they can implement, such as encryption, sharing controls, and some of the conditional access elements that Stephen demonstrated there around downloading and printing data. So the real value here is obviously using the tool initially to get that initial view, because again, that is a challenge, as one of the questions pertained earlier on, you have to discover where your data is and what your potential risk is, and then being able to have a good design. And again, the approach here was that eat the elephant approach. We started with one business unit, and we put in the retention model for that business unit, did the use case testing, did the UAT, got the the language that we're presenting back to the users in those tool tips and all those elements to be as kind of informative and useful as possible. And we helped the customer identify what level of training was likely to be required to help their staff, use this tooling so there'd be the least amount of business impact. So yeah, so it was a kind of a good example of an end-to-end approach. And then that customer will be looking to iterate that across other business units. And, over maybe 12 months, we'll get to a point where they'll have a good retention policy across their entire organization. Okay, so that's everything really. I think we've kind of addressed, what we really wanted to address today was some, what's available in the tooling, what the kind of concerns and that you might have, or you would have if you start looking at DLP and data classification. We've tried to give you some good recommendations, I hope, to help you in approaching a DLP project, both from the very initial stages of a strategy and a design element and a discovery element, and also in terms of the practical elements that Stephen showed around what the tooling can do and how powerful it can be, in terms of putting those controls in place. I see best practice on the slide. We'll probably say recommended practice or based on experience. The key things I would add there, and I'll throw it over to Stephen to add his thoughts, is start by trying to understand where your critical data is, and don't be trying to do too much too quickly. Really try and maybe focus in one or two business units, and explore the start with monitoring and then do maybe some basic monitoring controls, and then maybe start implementing some of the DLP elements, working with your end users to get to a point that it doesn't interfere in their productivity, but still achieves the risk mitigation controls that you can do, and then iterate that out around your business would be kind of my best suggestion. Stephen, would you have any kind of suggestions for the audience?
I think my suggestion would be to start with those basics. So make sure you've got those basic controls in place, that you're protecting the device, you're protecting the applications, before you then start to move on to more of the technical DLP policies and controls. Yep,
that's great advice. So listen, we're at time there, so everyone. So thank you very much. Thank you also for all the questions. It's great to get some interaction on these sessions, and hopefully this was of value to you. If there's anything you'd like to follow up on in terms of talking to myself or Stephen about anything we spoke about today, or anything that maybe we didn't cover that you have questions about, you can reach out to us. You can see some contact information there on the screen, or else you can reach out to any of the CWSI team or to maybe your Microsoft account manager. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day.